Picture a literal hell on earth. I mean, the girls are half-starved, hollow cheeks, frail frames. They're shivering through these agonizingly cold winters in paper-thin clothing. And diseases, typhus is just sweeping through their ranks with this terrifying efficiency. It is a place of pure, unrelenting misery, right? This is the dark, miserable reality of Lowood School that the classic narrative feeds us. It's totally designed to make you feel the absolute desperation of these orphans. But as we dig into the architecture of this story today, we're going to uncover a massive, glaring contradiction. Okay, let's dive into this staggering disconnect. So on one side, you've got these hell-on-earth realities, freezing children, starvation diets, rampant disease. But then look at the flip side. Right in the middle of all this hell, the students are systematically being taught conversational French, how to play the piano, geography, history, painting. And honestly, what's really interesting here is the sheer absurdity of it. Because these are highly prized accomplishments for a middle-class young lady. Just think about it. An underfunded charity school that supposedly can't even afford to put decent food in its pupils' stomachs can somehow casually afford a piano? It can afford to hire a dedicated French master? It has the budget for fine drawing paper and expensive paints? No way. It completely forces us to ask this core investigative question. How in the world could an orphan from a destitute charity school actually acquire these high society skills? It simply doesn't add up. So today in this explainer, we're exposing the Lowood hoax. We'll break down exactly how the novel created an institution that is, historically speaking, entirely impossible. And more importantly, we're going to figure out exactly why the author needed to invent it in the first place. All right, let's get right into the first part of our investigation, the charity school hoax, and really separating historical fact from fiction. To really understand the deception here, we have to pull back the curtain on the romanticized fiction and look at the hard historical facts. And the divide is absolutely brilliant. In 19th century England, historical charity schools had exactly one purpose, and that was social discipline. They were essentially just factories for producing humble, obedient workers. The curriculum was bare bones, basic reading, writing, simple arithmetic, relentless religious indoctrination, and for the girls, just endless needlework. They were being trained to be maids and laborers, that was it. Their absolute highest ceiling in life was to become a good servant. But then compare that to Lowood School. Suddenly we have governess training, French literature, piano lessons. Listen, a real charity school girl could never dream of becoming a governess, nor would she ever sit in a gentleman's library discussing French literature. The humanities-focused curriculum at Lowood, it's entirely fake. So the absolutely crucial point here is, why fake it? Well, it all comes down to narrative necessity. You see, the author had a major structural problem. First, her heroine absolutely must grow up to become a governess to drive the plot forward. Second, she has to be educated enough to converse as an intellectual equal with the wealthy Mr. Rochester. And third, therefore, she requires conversational French and piano skills. The author did literally the only thing she could do to solve this puzzle. She created an institution that never actually existed. She cleverly disguised a high-end finishing school inside a prison-like setting. It's not historical realism at all. It's just a narrative necessity disguised as a backdrop.
Which brings us to our next focus, Helen Burns and deconstructing a saint.
To truly understand the mechanics of this impossible school, we really have to look at its most famous victim. This is a character traditionally held up as the ultimate model of spiritual purity. Listen to her famous words, which are usually spoken of with this deep, deep reverence. Helen tells Jane, "It is far better to endure patiently a smart which nobody feels but yourself, than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you." She goes on to talk about how heathens and savage tribes hold on to revenge, but Christians and civilized nations disown it. The novel presents this 14-year-old girl as a literal saint, right? A model of Christian forgiveness who accepts horrific suffering without a single complaint. It wants us to sit back and admire her profound spiritual maturity. But let me propose a very different, much sharper reading here. What we're witnessing is not virtue. Actually, it's the horrific self-hypnosis of a victim. Helen has been so thoroughly brainwashed and shaped by the religious teaching she's absorbed that she can no longer even recognize the gross injustice of her own reality. Just think about it. She is starved, heavily neglected, beaten by her teachers, and her response is to thank God for it. She even tells Jane she's very happy to be dying. Let that sink in. A 14-year-old girl dying of typhus in a filthy charity school claims she is happy. As modern readers, our reaction really shouldn't be admiration. It should be horror. This isn't a saint. This is a brainwashed child whose abuse has basically been weaponized as virtue.
Now let's shift gears to a really suspicious chronological gap. Let's talk about the 2 years of silence. If you map out the heroine's timeline at this school, you hit this massive, glaring void that tells us pretty much everything we need to know about how this story is constructed. Let's slow down and really look at this timeline. So Jane spends 8 full years at Lowood. For her first 6 years as a student, the narrative is incredibly detailed. I mean, it lingers over every single cold, unpalatable meal, every freezing morning, every cruel and unusual punishment. We see all the suffering and starving. But then, we reach years 7 and 8. She's now a teacher. She is a young woman, 18 to 20 years old, standing at the front of her own classroom with power over other charity girls. And what does the narrative tell us about these 2 years? Absolutely nothing.
I mean, the author dedicates exactly 10 words to this entire era of her protagonist's life. I was a teacher for 2 years, with which I was not unhappy. That's it. 10 words. Complete narrative silence. We are completely refused any insight into how Jane actually treated her own students. Did she enforce the freezing rooms and starvation diets? Did she wield the cane? We just don't know.
So, why the total silence? Well, it's because the author fell into a massive narrative trap. She faced an impossible dilemma here. On one hand, if Jane is shown as a strict teacher, enforcing the rules of Lowood, well, then she becomes the very cruel oppressor she spent 6 years hating. But on the other hand, if Jane is shown as this remarkably kind and subversive teacher, then it implies her own childhood suffering wasn't really the result of an unbreakable systemic evil. It was just the individual cruelty of a few bad teachers. Either way, detailing her teaching years completely destroys that simple, heroic portrait of Jane the victim.
And this perfectly sets up our final point, the character processing factory. When we put all these pieces together, the impossible curriculum, the weaponized spirituality, the incredibly convenient narrative blackouts, a really clear picture emerges of what Lowood truly is. Let's trace the ruthless efficiency of this machine. Because Lowood isn't a real place. It is a character processing factory. It's like a giant assembly line. Step 1, strip the child of warmth and comfort to build sympathy. Step 2, inject them with intense religious ideas to forge resilience. Step 3, impossibly give them a middle-class skill set, the French and the piano, so they're actually useful for the story. And Step 4, ship them out to the next stage of the plot. Once Jane is processed, the author just stops writing about the school. The module simply closes. The author destroys historical reality entirely just to process a character.
And that leaves us with a pretty dark, lasting truth about the imagery we're fed. The story weaponizes the image of a dying girl to make us feel something profound. But we've got to remember what we uncovered today. Helen Burns is a warning, not a saint. She is the tragic, terrifying result of what happens when a child is systematically taught to love the very hand that beats her.
So, what does this all mean? Well, it really makes you wonder. If the victim's past is so heavily manipulated, what about the hero? In our next explainer, we're going to meet the romantic hero of the story. And we'll be asking the question, is his tragically dark, brooding past nothing but a carefully constructed alibi? You definitely won't want to miss the deceptions we uncover next. Until then, keep questioning the narrative.